Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at what it takes to file a lawsuit in Vietnam,
Oh, wow.
using some great guides from Lay and Tran, who are a leading firm over there.
Okay.
Um, and I got to say, preparing for this one, I found some really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm intrigued.
yeah, you would think Vietnam and lawsuits, what's the connection?
Right.
But just the fact that their statute of limitations for land rights is unlimited.
Oh, wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that is pretty unique.
So we'll definitely be getting into that.
Yeah.
But first, let's just look at statutes of limitations in general,
Okay.
because it can be very different depending on what the dispute is about.
Right.
Like if you're having a problem with a logistics trader,
Uh-huh.
you only have 9 months
9 months.
to file a suit.
Wow. That's not very long.
No, not a lot of time.
Especially if you're dealing with shipping and
Exactly.
all the complexities of that.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you have that unlimited one for land use.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what do you think is the historical reason for that?
It's a good question. Vietnam has a long history with land ownership. So
Right.
maybe disputes could even go back generations. But anyway, to start a lawsuit in Vietnam, you start with a petition.
Okay, so like you're setting the stage.
Yeah, laying the groundwork.
Yeah.
And you really want to make it comprehensive, like a strong foundation for a house, So you need to have all the parties involved laid out and a breakdown of what happened and when,
Okay.
strong legal basis for your claim and what you want the outcome to be.
So this is pretty detailed then.
You want it to be thorough. Yeah, but it doesn't have to be like a novel or anything.
Okay.
And actually, Vietnamese law lets you amend the petition as the case goes on.
Well, that's good. So you don't have to.
Right. You have some flexibility if new information comes up or whatever.
Exactly. Okay, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
But before you even get to that petition part, there's something called pre-action conduct.
Yeah, this is where it gets kind of tricky.
Okay.
Depending on the dispute, you might have to do certain things before you can even go to court.
Okay.
Like with labor disputes, you might have to try mediation first.
Uh-huh.
Or land use disputes could have steps you have to take based on a previous agreement.
So it's not as easy as I'm angry, I'm filing a lawsuit.
Right. It depends.
You have to.
There are very specific hoops to jump through.
Wow, okay.
It's really important to get legal help early so you don't mess up the process.
Yeah, like you're going through a maze and you need a guide.
Exactly.
Okay, so you've done all that pre-action stuff and your petition's ready to go.
Okay.
How do you make sure the other party, the defendant, knows about the lawsuit?
Right. That's where the rules of service come in.
Okay.
They lay out how to formally tell them about the proceedings.
Mm-hmm.
The best way is personal service, where you literally hand them the documents.
Okay.
But you can also use the postal service or a courier.
Okay.
And you can even do it electronically, like email, but only if they agree to it beforehand.
Wait, so you have to get their permission to email them a lawsuit?
It does seem a little strange in this day and age, but the point is to make sure they get it and understand it.
Okay, so it's not just about sending it off. You want to be sure they actually receive it.
Exactly.
Now, what if they just ignore the whole thing?
That's not going to work out too well for them in Vietnam.
Okay.
If they don't respond, the court can still go ahead with the case and make a ruling based on the evidence.
So you can't just ghost the court.
Nope.
Okay, well, let's talk about something else that I found really interesting about Vietnam.
Okay.
They don't have class action lawsuits,
That's right.
which is a huge difference from a lot of Western legal systems.
Right.
Why is that?
It's complicated. There's history and culture and the legal system all tied up in it.
Okay.
They do allow for collective action, but it's not the same as a class action where one person represents a big group of people who've all been harmed in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has to file their own petition.
Wow, so if a company does something wrong and hurts 100 people, all 100 of them have to file separate lawsuits.
Yeah, they can choose one representative later on.
Okay.
And the court can decide to combine similar cases to make things more efficient, but
Yeah.
that's up to them.
So it seems like it's a lot harder for individuals to get justice in Vietnam if they've been wronged by a big company.
Yeah, it's a really important difference to think about.
And we're going to keep exploring that and other unique parts of Vietnam's legal system in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Vietnam's legal system. We've already uncovered some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
Now we're going to talk about jurisdiction.
Okay, so figuring out which court is the right one for your case.
Exactly. It's all laid out in their civil procedure code.
So is it as simple as just looking at the closest court to where the problem happened?
Not quite. There are actually several factors that determine a court's jurisdiction in Vietnam.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the main things they look at?
Well, first, you've got what's called subject matter jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
That basically means the court has to have the right kind of expertise to handle a case.
Makes sense.
So, for example, a labor dispute would go to a labor court,
Right.
and a commercial contract dispute would go to a commercial court.
So they're making sure the right people are handling the right cases.
Exactly. Now, let's say you're in a dispute with a company that operates in several different provinces.
Okay, yeah, that gets tricky. How do you even know where to file the lawsuit?
That's where territorial jurisdiction comes in.
Okay.
Usually you would file the lawsuit in the court where the defendant's main place of business is,
Okay.
or where they live. But there are some exceptions.
Like what?
Well, if it's a real estate dispute,
Mm-hmm.
it usually goes to the court where the property is located.
Yeah, that makes sense if you're arguing about land ownership or zoning or something like that.
Right, and there are some other situations where the plaintiff gets to choose the court.
Oh, interesting. So the person filing the lawsuit?
Yeah, they get to pick.
But doesn't that open the door for people to try and pick a court that they think will be more favorable to their case?
It's definitely a possibility, which is why having clear rules about jurisdiction is so important.
Right, it keeps things fair.
Now let's move on to the lawsuit itself, specifically the initial complaint.
Okay, in Vietnam they call it the petition, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The petition is basically your opening argument.
So it's like setting the tone for the whole case.
You want it to be clear, concise, and persuasive.
Okay.
Tran stresses the importance of including all the key elements like who's involved, what happened, and what you want to happen.
So it's kind of like telling a story but with a legal twist?
Exactly. And just like a good story, you need evidence to back up your claims.
So things like contracts and witness statements.
Exactly.
Now, what about those amendments we talked about earlier?
Right. So Vietnamese law does let you make changes to the petition,
Okay.
but they have to be justified, and they can't completely change the nature of the case.
So you can't just keep switching up your story.
Right. And usually you need the court's permission for any major changes.
Okay, so there's
That's-
flexibility, but within reason.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, once the petition is finalized and all the necessary amendments are made, what happens next?
Well, we have to make sure the defendant knows about the lawsuit, right?
Exactly. It's called serving the defendant.
And we talked about the different ways to do that, right?
Yes. Personal service, postal service, courier services.
And email if they agree to it.
Right.
But what if they just ignore the whole thing? Like they think if they pretend it's not happening, it'll go away.
Ignoring a lawsuit is never a good idea, and in Vietnam, it can really backfire.
How so?
If the defendant doesn't respond, the court can just go ahead without them and make a decision based on what the plaintiff has presented.
Oh, wow. So they could actually lose the case by default.
Exactly.
So you really can't just bury your head in the sand and hope the problem goes away.
Nope. Now let's get back to something we touched on earlier, the fact that Vietnam doesn't have class action lawsuits.
Right. It's a pretty big difference from legal systems like we have in the U.S.
It raises some important questions about access to justice.
Yeah, like is it really fair if a company does something wrong that affects a lot of people and each of those people has to file their own lawsuit?
Right, especially for people who might not have the money or the legal knowledge to do that.
It seems like it would be really difficult.
It is, and it makes you wonder if individual lawsuits can really address widespread harm in the same way that a class action can.
Yeah, are there any arguments in favor of this system?
Some people say that having individual petitions ensures that each claim is legitimate and that people are really invested in the outcome.
Okay.
And they point out that Vietnam's system allows for similar cases to be combined, which can make things more efficient.
So there are pros and cons to both approaches.
Exactly. It's a trade-off between individual control and collective power.
Definitely gives us a lot to think about, and we're going to continue this discussion in part 3 of our deep dive.
Yes. We'll explore some more nuances of Vietnam's legal system, including things like contingency fees and third-party litigation funding.
Our deep divers, welcome back for the final part of our look at Vietnam's legal system.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, who knew there was so much to learn about filing a lawsuit in Vietnam?
Right. From unlimited statutes of limitations to no class actions, it's definitely unique.
Okay, so let's talk about something that I know can be a big deal in legal cases, contingency fees.
Okay.
So that's when a lawyer gets paid based on whether they win the case or not.
Yeah. Is that even allowed in Vietnam?
It is, but there are some rules about it.
Of course.
Both the law on lawyers and the Code of Professional Ethics for Lawyers lay out some guidelines.
Makes sense to keep things ethical.
Exactly. So are there like limits on how much a lawyer can earn through contingency fees?
For civil cases, there isn't a specific limit, but for criminal cases, it's capped.
Okay, that makes sense.
And lawyers aren't allowed to ask for or receive any extra payments from their clients on top of what's in the contract.
That seems fair. Keeps everything transparent.
Right. And another important rule is that lawyers can't promise a specific outcome in a case.
So no guarantees.
Exactly. Even the best lawyer in the world can't guarantee a win in court.
Right. Too many factors involved.
Now, what if you have a case, but you can't afford to pay a lawyer upfront?
That's a tough situation.
That's where third-party litigation funding comes in.
Okay, I've heard of those.
So basically, a third party, someone not involved in the case, gives you money to cover legal costs.
And in return, they get a share of the winnings if you win.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like an investment.
It is, and it can be a great way for people to access legal representation that they wouldn't be able to afford otherwise.
So is that common in Vietnam?
It's becoming more common. But here's the interesting thing. Vietnamese law doesn't say anything specific about time limits for getting third-party litigation funding.
Really? So there's no rule about how long you have to find someone to fund your case?
Not yet. It's a pretty new thing, and the law hasn't quite caught up.
It's interesting how Vietnam's legal system seems to be constantly adapting to new ideas and practices.
Yeah, it's definitely a system in transition.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly informative. We've covered so much ground, from the very first steps of filing a lawsuit to the ins and outs of contingency fees and third-party funding.
It's been a great overview. I think the main takeaway is that Vietnam's legal system is unique.
Right. It takes inspiration from other systems, but it also has its own distinct characteristics.
And those nuances are really important for anyone who's involved in legal proceedings in Vietnam.
So, as always, seeking expert legal advice is crucial.
Absolutely. Whether you're an individual, a business owner, or a legal professional, having someone who knows the system inside and out can make all the difference.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Vietnam's legal landscape.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you found it insightful. And as always, if you want to learn more, be sure to check out Lee and Tran's website.
They have a wealth of information available.
Until next time,
Jacob.
deep divers, happy exploring.